Welcome, everybody. I'm going to introduce our speakers and moderator to get this panel started. Our first speaker is Beth Alton. Beth is an executive director, or the executive director of the Hillsborough Transportation Planning Organization in Tampa, where she leads an award-winning team of planners with a long-range vision of a transportation system that is safe and accessible to all the residents. She's directed many acclaimed studies using innovative research methods in a collaborative context and forged new interagency partnerships that break down silos to deliver projects. We also have James Cromar from the Broward Metropolitan Planning Organization, where he serves as Deputy Executive Director of Mobility Initiatives for the MPO. He has 30 years of professional experience, combining private and public sector experience with a focus on the integration of transportation and land use planning. He spent 12 years as a Denver-based consultant and then moved to South Florida in 2002, where he worked as a planner at the municipal, county, and MPO levels. He directs the implementation and execution of the MPO's core products to deliver projects in coordination with various municipalities and community stakeholders. James is also focused on climate change and resiliency issues for the Broward MPO, starting with the formation of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact in 2009. Dr. John Rennie is also on our panel today. He is a professor and an urban planning expert with 3 books and over 130 publications, including Adaptation, Urbanism, and Resilient Communities, Transforming Streets to Address Climate Change, which was released in May of 2021 by EarthScan of Routledge Press. In 2020, he co-founded Priority Funds, LLC, which is a national private equity fund that invests in sustainable real estate sourced through crowdfunding and private off-market opportunities. Dr. Rennie has been at FAU for 5 years and has previously held teaching and research appointments at leading universities, including Oxford University. And our moderator for today is John Englander, a noted oceanographer, author of 2 seminal works, High Tide on Main Street, which blazed a trail in 2012, explaining climate change and its unstoppable and most profound effect, sea level rise. That easy-to-read book catapulted him to the world stage. His latest book, Moving to Higher Ground, is an update and takes this issue further, pushing us to look ahead to mid-century and beyond, when rising sea levels will begin to change the coastlines of over 140 nations and tens of thousands of coastal communities. John will moderate today, but I'll start off by introducing him with a question. John, at our last session, we heard from Alex Marshall, who explained that the character of our cities is something that's determined by the transportation systems that we choose for them. That's an interesting statement, because if we think about it, the difference between South Florida and Paris, France, has a lot to do with the main ways of getting around, either by foot and on the metro or by car. Given that we live so close to the water here in South Florida and are experiencing sea level rise, do you think that Fort Lauderdale's moniker as Venice of America might foretell the future character of our region? And if so, how do we adapt to that?
Thanks, Tony. I happen to live in the area, but I do get to talk about this all over the world. And I find that transportation lenses through which to look at climate change and sea level, because transportation planning is typically done 30 years to 100 years in the future. And not many other professions actually look at that with that time perspective. So I really appreciate this opportunity that this panel has been assembled to address. Before I get to your question about Venice, which I will certainly do, I would frame things a little bit and say that while we see climate change headlines in the news in the last week, from Germany floods to China to Arizona to fires and so on, we're all aware of climate change. It's really useful if we think of climate change as 3 distinct issues with 3 distinct solutions. One is how to slow the warming, and certainly transportation is involved with that, how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. But even if we went to 100% electric vehicles and renewable energy today and forevermore, the weather is not going to go back to what it was 30 years ago. We've warmed the planet, and we need to be resilient in addition to being sustainable, therefore. Resilient to me is recovering, either enduring and sustaining during an event or recovering after an event, like flooding. That's resiliency. But the third thing we have to do is think about being adaptive. When sea level is many feet higher, it won't require sustainability and resiliency, it will require adaptation. So if we think of the climate change problem as how do we slow the warming, which transportation is involved, but that's a global paradigm. In other words, what we do here just blends with global carbon dioxide emissions. 2 is how to design for more resilience. And 3 is how to adapt in the face of rising sea level in particular, which is different than the inland flooding and other kinds of flooding we get from storms and tides. So with that as context, now let me get to your question about Venice. Anybody that's been to Venice recently knows that the idyllic city that we all remember or have seen with the gondolas and so on is changed. It's changed because Venice is sinking because they've been putting groundwater out, and I think that clearly this city is subsiding, meaning sea level's rising faster. St. Mark's Square, which I remember visiting 50 years ago as a kid, it didn't used to flood. Now it floods 80 to 100 days a year because of sea level rise, and the city's sinking. The new gates that you've heard of, the billions of dollars spent on these, the Mose gates, which can be put in place during high water, they have a limited projected benefit because they trap sewage in the lagoon and make the city untenable. And there's no way to put a sewage system in the city. So Venice is a boating capital and a nice imagery, but it also forces us to confront the reality that as water levels rise, we can't go back to some idyllic, simple vision. In Broward or Hillsborough, canal front homes that are on porous limestone are going to see water coming up higher and higher. We need to change building codes. We need to change our design paradigm to sea level being several feet higher this century, even if we don't get to the 11 feet that we're told is a worst case scenario. But transportation is the perfect place to start because it is an issue between the private sector and the public sector. It invites innovative design. It's a practical issue, and thinking out 30 years to mid-century is well within the culture of transportation planning. So with that, I certainly now turn this over to the experts in transportation and local communities. And I think John's going to go next. Is that correct? Did I get that order right?
Yeah. So I guess thank you so much. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking because I think that the interesting discussion will happen kind of between the back and forth with all of us. So I'll just kind of start out with a brief intro. So my background is in looking at land use and real estate and its connection to transportation systems, particularly looking at how we can invest in new ways of configuring our communities that reduce automobile dependence, particularly walkable communities, transit-oriented developments. These are all very hot topics in the real estate field, and I've been working for many years in South Florida, now 5 years, with the Urban Land Institute and others through FAU, to try to figure out how we can promote these issues. And now that we have the expansion of rail systems and the Bright Line in South Florida, we have an unprecedented opportunity in South Florida to try to catch up, frankly, with some other cities that have been doing it for a fair bit longer, including cities like Denver, Colorado, even Charlotte, North Carolina, Dallas, Texas. These are all cities that are booming and growing just like us here in South Florida. The challenge that we have in South Florida is that we are very much vulnerable to climate change. Now, on the one hand, we have this concept of adaptation, which is very important for us because we need to address both adaptation and mitigation at the same time. What is adaptation? What's mitigation? Mitigation simply means we need to reduce our carbon emissions, and that needs to happen at a global scale, all the way down to the local level. Because if we want to achieve certain climate change goals and reducing, the amount of temperature that's going to increase in the future, we need to come up with very important strategies to do that. But on the other hand, there's a certain amount of heat built into the oceans that are going to lead to continued sea level rise that we need to be prepared for. And even if we stop using fossil fuels today, we will still continue to see the impacts of climate change, throughout the rest of our lives and our children and grandchildren's lives. So we need to adapt our communities to make sure that our buildings and our infrastructure can withstand these impacts. And that's kind of work that we're doing, and that's kind of more about the adaptation side of it. And it's important to do both, but it's very important to know that both are very necessary, including the mitigation, the adaptation. So I'll stop there and allow my other colleagues to speak, and then we'll continue on.
You want to go ahead, Beth?
Sure, thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the discussion today. And thank you, Broward MPO, for once again, making that connection across the peninsula. I've been privileged to be part of the long-range transportation planning discussion in Tampa Bay for a couple of decades now. And I think the role of metropolitan planning organizations is, it's in a way, it's connecting vision to dollars and numbers about how can we really make a difference. So it's sort of making it real when our community members say that they want change. And, just sort of a big picture perspective, we have had a couple of very different transportation paradigms in this country over the last couple of centuries. Had a very water-oriented transportation system for many, many decades. And then we built a rail-based transportation system. And then we built an automobile-oriented transportation system. And we've been having a conversation in Tampa Bay and many other metropolitan areas about needing to make another big change and reshaping our transportation systems to allow more choices that are not automobile dependent. That's a big shift, and it's a decision about investing in our transportation systems. And it runs right up against the very limited resources that we have for public expenditures. So just bringing kind of that reality into the conversation is a role that our organization plays on a continuing basis. But certainly resilience and sustainability is a big factor in that conversation. And to that end, one of the things that we've brought to the table is number 2 on Mr. Englander's list of topics, which is how do we make the systems that we have more resilient to the changes that we already know are happening. Thank you.
And then I'll talk a little bit about my experience here in Broward. Is along with John Rennie, I have some time spent in Denver, and there was a certain environmental mindset in Colorado that isn't necessarily as prevalent here in Florida, although there are some strong environmental people who are concerned about environmental issues. The big event for us at the Broward MPO turning point was in 2012 when Superstorm Sandy washed out portions of A1A in Fort Lauderdale, that section north of Sunrise Boulevard. And for a few weeks, there was a lack of connection, and there was a lot of discussion about, well, what do we do? Do we possibly consider not rebuilding the road because this is on the barrier island and it's a place where there's going to be more issues in the future? But there were also questions about economic activity in the region. It's along the beach. There's a lot of hotels and tourists and people spending money, and there are people who lived along the beach. So the decision was to rebuild the road at great expense. It was about $10 million for a half-mile segment. So we do have some solutions that we can apply, but they are going to be expensive, and we're going to have to make some choices. As transportation planners, we need to take a longer-term perspective. So we know that emergencies will come up. We had to respond quickly. Within 6 weeks, our MPO board approved the funding to get the A1A roadway improved. But we also want to be smart and plan ahead for the future so that we're making long-term, we're implementing long-term strategies for increasing the resiliency of our transportation system, and knowing that we will have to respond to emergencies as they come up, but that when there are not emergencies, we can be smartly investing the limited funds that we have toward improving the network and making it work for the people who live here and people who come and spend money and earn money here.
I think it's time for our first poll question, if we could, since we've heard from each of the speakers.
Tony, while we're doing that, I just wanted to kind of build upon something that James was just saying regarding, infrastructure and roads and streets. And this is a topic that is addressed in that recent book, Adaptation Urbanism, that my co-author Billy Fields and I just published this May. And that's looking at streets, from a multi-dimensional perspective. Typically in the past, we have looked at streets that are, about moving cars, and how important it is to think about not just the street as a way to move cars or even people, but how to address the climate impacts that we're seeing, like heavy rain, increased prevalence of heavy rain. How do we use landscaping to improve the livability of a street, increase shade canopy, increase the green space, which has, psychological benefits to people being around greenery, and doing that in a way that helps to manage some of the climate impacts that we're seeing, such as heavy rain flooding.
We're seeing the poll results on the screen.
So 72% say they're making investment decisions based upon climate change. Very interesting.
And I guess this comes into the next topic that we're going to be talking about a little bit too, is people making decisions about coming to South Florida and investing private funds in this area. From a short-term or longer-term perspective, I don't want to presuppose that question. I'll let whoever's going to talk about that lead us into that. But it shows that there's a strong level of interest in making investments to support climate improvements.
So we're doing some work looking right now at property values and sea level rise, and future sea level rise. So what is the market saying with regard to private? There's been some studies that have been done previously that have started to show that people are making investment decisions to buy properties on high ground. And we're doing a larger comprehensive study of the 3 South Florida counties to kind of see what additional research we could find on that. And we're in the middle of that study, so I can't report any of the results yet. But we are seeing, we're seeing these what they're calling climate gentrification. So Little Haiti has been kind of considered one of these neighborhoods where developers are going and buying lots and redeveloping, not only because it's well located to the rail corridor and to downtown Miami and to Miami Beach and other areas, but also because it's high ground. And so the question that I'm interested in, is it's partially a transportation mobility question, because these neighborhoods are well located, but they're also higher ground. And we're hearing, discussions that, are we then, shifting this into becoming a equity issue for those who can't afford to live in those particular higher ground neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's curious in South Florida compared to some other places where maybe the lowlands that get flooded tend to be less desirable places to live. In South Florida, people want to be near the water. People want to be near the coast. And so that doesn't become the disincentive that it was in other places. So if they are looking for higher ground to move to, they might be moving to areas that might have been less desirable or lower income or that hadn't had that level of investment. So that is a challenge that we have to be looking at. The flip side of it, though, is as we look at making investments in resiliency improvements, there needs to be an economic base to support that level of investment. There's questions about trade-offs. There was a study recently that came out last year at the Climate Change Summit. There's a roadway in the Keys that will cost about $100 million to improve, and it serves 30 houses. And so is that a wise use of limited government funds? We look at Miami Beach, where they're doing a lot of roadway improvements, and they have a strong economic base that will support that level of hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to pay back the cost of building those improvements. And it's a combination of public and private funding. And we're going to be doing some work in Broward looking at specific corridors. And we have that question, is there an economic base to support the improvements that are necessary to make those areas resilient for the future? Again, we have needs throughout the county. Beth and I will talk probably a little bit more about our long-range plans, where we develop a long list of needs and there's this much money. And so we can't do everything. And so we're going to have to make some hard choices and look at different funding sources, not just the federal and state sources. Maybe there are local sources. Maybe it's the investment from the private development community as they come in and do things in different areas. So, it'll be a challenge.
Yeah, James is exactly right. Setting priorities in some kind of rational way is going to be very important because there are going to be a lot of difficult choices coming up as we figure out how to adapt to these changing conditions. So, one of the things that we've started to do is to rank our roadway segments based on not only their vulnerability, but also their criticality. And criticality from an economic point of view, from an evacuation point of view, from a supporting communities who are particularly vulnerable or who have been underserved by infrastructure decisions in the past. And so combining all of those things together to try to set priorities on where we start is going to be very important. But I think equally important for all of our communities is going to be communicating about what we are doing, so that our public has confidence that we're systematically working to reduce vulnerabilities to climate change.
We have a very
I think
good
that's so
question
key,
in
Beth.
Q&A that I think I'd like to throw to the panelists because it's on topic. We have a question from George Platt. I don't know if the panelists can see it in the Q&A, but if not, I'll read it. From a private sector point of view, 36% or 35 trillion of the current investment through pension funds, private equity, et cetera, is in sustainable investments or ESG. They are already there and expanding that investment. The real question is where the public investment is and how we pay for it. If a segment of Congress is unwilling to find new sources of revenue and innovative programs, how does the public, what can the public do? What needs to be done?
Tony, I'd like to take the first crack at this. I was looking at this question and it's a really, really good question. A couple of things. Number one is that, what we're seeing right now is a fundamentally flawed fiscal policy on how we fund transportation in the United States. Okay. And it's been going on for many, many decades. It's the gas tax. ARK Invest, okay, one of the leading Wall Street ETF investment companies, their Big Ideas report 2021, states that by 2026 or 2025, the average electric Toyota Camry will cost $18,000 compared to the average gasoline Toyota Camry, which will cost $26,000. So battery technology is making electric vehicles cheaper. When that happens, and when the bulk of new cars switches over to electric vehicles by the end of the century, and I serve on the long range advisory committee to the Florida Department of Transportation, they are telling us they're expecting revenues to start to drop off for the gas tax into the 2030s. Okay, Florida, because we don't have an income tax, has a higher reliance on the gas tax than many other states. When that happens, we're not going to have a lot of dollars in the public sector to pay for our transportation infrastructure. What's going to happen? Well, option one, are we going to institute an income tax to pay for it? Probably not in Florida, right? Are we going to raise other fees? Maybe. Is it going to outweigh what we're losing in the gas tax? I doubt it. What's going to happen is the burden of paying for transportation infrastructure is increasingly going to be shifted to local governments, in Florida, particularly county governments. Now, Broward County is already ahead of the curve. They've already passed a tax. It's going to generate, I think, like $16 billion to fund local transportation infrastructure over the next probably 27, 28 years now. Palm Beach County hasn't done it yet. Miami-Dade County has, various pockets of money to fund infrastructure, but this is the elephant in the room. I will say one other thing is that the infrastructure bill in Congress right now does have a very high level of commitment to infrastructure and resilience. But again, it's paid for with the federal gas tax, and there is no alternative solutions right now to fund that as our gas taxes fall off a cliff, which will happen by the end of the century.
Yeah, that's a great point about the gas tax. It's something that we've talked about a lot, and there are already some forecasts for our long-range transportation plans here in Florida that basically show that tailing off. And so, this is a question that we've been talking about for quite a while. What replaces the gas tax? And the local option sales taxes that can be approved by local voters, that's an important source. It is a somewhat volatile source. It doesn't have the tie back, sort of the rational nexus between, I'm creating this cost for the community and I'm also paying for it at the same time. And so, one of the other ideas that's been floated, it doesn't seem to have any legs in Congress right now, is fees associated with vehicle miles traveled. So that would apply to electric vehicles. And so you could, there could be an electronic odometer reading. You could report it when you do your annual vehicle registration. And you'd be paying a fee like the gas tax, but based on the vehicle miles that you use and that the impacts that you are creating on the roads. That might be particularly useful as we are moving into an environment of shared mobility and mobility as a service. There's been a lot of discussion about, will people continue to own their own vehicles, or will they have subscription services? And if we rely more and more on mobility on demand systems, there may be additional impacts on the roads that people aren't necessarily thinking about. So like you think about the amount of time that taxis used to circulate while they were waiting to pick up a fare, that's happening now with Uber and Lyft. And there have been studies showing that circulation of empty vehicles often happens in the most congested areas. And those vehicles tend to be occupied about 60% of the time. So you're adding a lot of additional vehicle miles onto your transportation system that may already be overburdened. And if we move towards a framework where the transportation system is funded through some kind of tax or fee on vehicle miles that are being put on the system, it would provide a disincentive to that.
I wanted to throw in the Broward perspective. We now have incorporated resiliency projects into our long-range plan and have identified funding to do the preliminary engineering. And as we're working with the Florida Department of Transportation to move these projects forward, we're starting to have the discussions about where will the funding come for these improvements. State, federal money, as John and Beth have been talking about, the different sources that are available, but there will be a request to look at some of the local funding sources. So for example, in Broward County, the voters approved a transportation surtax, which I believe included some elements of addressing resiliency. You know, not 100% of the money, but that was one of the topics that was covered in that surtax. As I mentioned before, in certain places, the private development community will chip in to do their certain improvements. But it's going to require a collaborative, creative, innovative approach to fund all of these different things. And we may find, you know, as Beth mentioned, in Broward, we've also identified our priority corridors, the most vulnerable, the ones that have the greatest role in the network. But we may find that the most vulnerable, the corridors of greatest need, we can't figure out how to fund those, whereas there might be others that are less critical, but the funding solutions will come into play. So we'll be playing that out over the next few years and having to make some difficult decisions about maybe we have to divert funds from certain projects to other ones to move those forward.
So James, I'm looking at two questions that come from our audience, and maybe we'll try to combine them. Could we talk a little more about some specific short-term projects, maybe one or two midterm projects, and what would be considered a long-term project, but also the factor of how to fund education dollars, because obviously this is a very important aspect to the MPO's effort, and the Vision 2100 is the public engagement and the education component. So could we talk a little bit about specific projects that might be considered short, medium, long-term? I know that was an issue John Englander talked about, timelines and how important that is. To answer the two questions, perhaps.
Great, yeah. So in Broward, I'm going to take a step back again to the 2012 project on A1A, because John Rennie had mentioned something about it that I didn't include previously. The state did come in and fix the roadway, put in 30 to 40 feet of steel sheeting to protect the water from coming under the road. And then the city, working with the county, city of Fort Lauderdale and the county, came in along with the MPO and did investments for complete streets improvements. So previously it was a 5-lane road, very uninviting. That segment now has wider sidewalks, bike lanes, parking, ADA access. It's a much better corridor, a medium with landscaping. So we took advantage of the opportunity for that investment to do something better. Currently in Hollywood along A1A, there are a variety of different partners coming together. The city, working with the Hollywood Beach CRA and Florida Department of Transportation, have been doing improvements along A1A, addressing drainage, multimodal mobility issues. And then there are some perpendicular side streets that are flooding, and the CRA has a program to improve those streets where currently the water comes up to the doorways of buildings where there may be some seniors that have no way to get out. And so it becomes a life safety issue also from just a rainstorm that can flood those roads. So again, a combination of funding sources in Hollywood. In the midterm, you know, I hate sometimes that government can be so slow. We've identified 8 priority corridors in our 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And we are starting to develop the framework for those plans. FDOT has some money. The Florida Department of Transportation has assigned funds, I believe in 2024 or 2025, to do the actual engineering on those corridors. So meanwhile, we're working with local experts to figure out, well, what are the parameters of that project? Do we not just look at the roadway itself and how to, you know, do we raise the road by itself and that solves the resiliency issues? Well, there are single family homes nearby, there are businesses. You raise the road, where's the water going to go? Is it going to just push the flooding issue onto those neighborhoods? Are there equity issues of of different people, disadvantaged communities or such. And so we want to establish a framework so that those studies are more holistic, that it's not just solving the transportation problem, but taking a bigger picture approach. And then from the long-term horizon, this whole Vision 2100 program involves education. The Broward MPO's charge is, as Beth knows with the MPOs, we have a 20-year planning horizon. Our most recent plan went out to the year 2045. But we also developed a vision for the year 2100, acknowledging that there are problems that we face that have longer horizons. If we just look 20 years out, well, it's 30 and 40 years out that some of the bigger climate change resiliency issues will be hitting us. So we can't ignore those. We can plan ahead for the future. And along with that, we have these forums. We have different ways of reaching out to people. And there's also a call to action to involve public and private sectors to come together to look at solutions. This was very helpful in Broward with the different surtax options that the private sector worked with government to garner support to get the voters to approve a surtax that's going to be paying for transportation infrastructure and generating, it was projected about $300 million a year. And so that private sector support is key to conveying the message to the elected officials and to the and others from the public that this is something that we need to do, that we need to be addressing.
Can I add to that?
Go ahead, Beth.
I just wanted to say that that your work on showing why that sales tax is needed and valuable is so important. And I wanted to offer one more example, if I could, and that is, as you know, as we've looked at some of our most vulnerable and critical road links, you know, of course, we're seeing them in low-lying areas, and sometimes those are causeways, and they're the approach to bridges. And the bridges, as they are reconstructed on their bridge replacement schedules, are often raised in elevation. But we don't necessarily have that kind of investment strategy for the approaches to the bridges, you know. So how do we address that? And you know, and the challenge there is that if they get inundated, it's possible that there's going to be scouring, erosion, and that then after the waters recede, those roads aren't passable, and that can then be very debilitating as your community is trying to recover in a post-disaster scenario where you're already dealing with probable shortage of materials and difficulty getting supplies distributed. So it can be very challenging to have a major roadway segment out of commission and have impacts on your local economy and impacts on your public health. You know, so we've been looking at, well, what's the return on investment then for going ahead and making an investment up front? And what if it's something simple, like you harden the pavement, you harden the subbase. So next time you go through and resurface that roadway segment, maybe you bump up the cost of that project by about 50%. So you're not just putting down an extra layer of asphalt on top, you're actually milling it all up, putting down a more solid subbase. Maybe you're even investing in some shoreline protections along the edge of it. Maybe you're doing some things with the drainage systems. But it requires that additional investment. And just, you know, taking that resurfacing project and bumping that expenditure up by 50% can save you so much money and so much pain in the long term if that roadway segment isn't available to you. So just kudos to Broward MPO for making that case.
Thank you, Beth. I'm going to look at a couple. There's another good question from our.
Tony,
If
I
could,
just wanted to mention one thing though that I think is very relevant to the audience here, and it's so we've been talking a lot about the hard aspect of transportation infrastructure. You know, the bridges, the roadways, the railways, right? But probably the more exciting thing that right now is occurring, and I just read an article by Richard Florida and Joel Kotkin, who are, you know, two international experts in these issues that said that there is more change having occurred during COVID in the transportation world than since World War II. And that's because so many people are at home working or doing meetings just like we're doing right now on Zoom, and that's reducing travel. But it's not just the reduction in travel, it's the technology that is enabling these changes to occur. And some of that technology is having significant benefits to transportation itself, whether A, it's travel reduction, or B, new modes of mobility. One that I've been impressed with is Free Ride. They're working, I think, with the Broward MPO and other local governments across South Florida and offering these on-demand golf cart shuttles. But in terms of the business community, it's, technology and tech and meeting transportation right now is generating some incredible new opportunities that we haven't ever seen before that can solve some of these resilience issues. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there.
Thanks, John. Getting back to the question, that we have some very good questions coming up in the Q&A. One has to do with the recent discussions in the city of Fort Lauderdale with building tunnels. So I'm going to direct this to both Johns. There's been talk recently in South Florida about underground transportation solutions, seemingly with little mention of sea level rise and vulnerability. And I'm going to add to this because the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact is predicting about 3 feet of sea level rise in 30 years and 11 feet of sea level rise by 2100. So the question is it smart for officials to be seriously considering subsurface transportation infrastructure in our coastal communities?
Well, let me speak to that briefly, Tony. That the ability to predict sea level rise is misunderstood. It largely depends on how warm the world's going to get, and then some uncertainties about Antarctica and Greenland will melt. But so whether we take the 3 feet by mid-century or the 11 feet possible by end of century, there's a wide range. But to your point, if we're going to design future systems, whether they be tunnels or elevated roadways or rail systems or any of the other things being discussed, we do need to build in the adaptability in the future. And I recommend to most audiences that I talk to that start thinking about 3 feet or a meter in as little as 30 years. That becomes a benchmark and gets us to raise our sights. We need to look at everything that's been mentioned here in the last half hour in terms of how to pay for systems and the scale of systems and people who work from home and electric vehicles and all of those things. Resiliency to both the traditional coastal erosion as described from that hurricane, the 2012, when a roadway was washed out, to the flooding we're seeing more and more during king tide events following the tide cycle, which are getting higher and higher because sea level is rising slowly. But sea level, we must remember, is the game changer, and it's going to cause us to think different. And as Beth said, just having a plan and communicating to the business community can be very helpful, because this is not just a South Florida problem. We think it is, but Mobile, Alabama and Charleston, South Carolina have the same problem we do, and as does Copenhagen and as does Singapore. We need to think for the future, because the business community will take confidence that we're doing short, medium, and long-term planning, as you referenced, Tony, that we are thinking of multiple timeframes from multiple perspectives of an event, an emergency, as well as this long-term incremental change, which is not just going to pick on South Florida, from Bangladesh and Vietnam, as I say, to London, England, or Copenhagen, Seattle and Vancouver are all going to be equally affected. And we can be a leader because it's so obvious a problem in Florida. And just the fact of laying out that we have a plan, that we are thinking on all 3 factors of how to reduce the emissions and get off of fossil fuels, yes, but how to be resilient to events, yes, and how to begin planning in advance of sea level rise can catapult us to be seen as leaders and give people a sense of confidence, because the world is not going to go away from the shoreline. We will have to adapt to the shoreline. We have no choice, from transportation and recreation and all the other virtues of the ocean, let's not think that we're all moving to Denver. Okay, that's not realistic, a mile above sea level. Okay, we are going to adapt to sea level rise. The question is whether we do it with planning or through emergencies, which are going to happen more and more frequently. And so what I find exciting here is the different perspectives. I'm not in transportation planning per se, but I do get to speak to transportation leaders in different parts of the world. But this multifaceted discussion between academics, between government officials, MPO people, transportation, and the business leaders of the community is really important to just convey the message: we are looking to the horizon. We're starting to plan for the future. And this is not just about Florida as a problem. 10,000 coastal communities are threatened by rising sea level and other climate change issues. Be a leader.
So John, and all the panelists, we have another question was actually on our agenda. What are some specific things the business community can do to become more involved in helping to improve resiliency in Broward County? So we'll let each of you answer that one.
Well, I was going to reply briefly to the earlier question about tunnels. I mean, look, and I think Elon Musk is a brilliant guy, okay, but he is a rocket scientist, and he's really good at creating very successful companies. But you know, he does need to learn a little bit more about transportation planning. And I think tunnels are a good idea to solve specific targeted issues in very specific targeted locations. It is not, I've looked at his strategy for the underground tunnels, and I don't buy that as our future. I don't think we're going to put tunnels underground everywhere to solve our transportation problems. And it's because in reality, we have not seen a growth in vehicle miles traveled, which is the metric we use to measure traffic. We haven't, you know, we are seeing growth in, you know, traffic in South Florida, but nationally we've seen a leveling off. And with COVID, we've seen, you know, kind of a downward correction of traffic as well. You know, you go to London, you go to all the cities that John Englander just mentioned, Copenhagen. You know, these cities are the leaders in resilience. They're the leaders in tackling climate emissions. And what they're doing is they're investing in shifting modes from driving to what we call a multimodal transportation system. It means that, you know, people have the option to bike, they have the option to walk, they have the option to take a bus, they have the option to take an Uber and a Lyft. And as we get to a place where Elon Musk's vision comes to reality with autonomous cars, and I believe much more wholeheartedly that that vision is going to come to reality, we'll be able to more efficiently use our surface roadway streets to be able to create this multimodal system. And if you want to ride by yourself, you can do that. If you want to carpool, you'll be able to do that, and you'll be able to save a lot of money. And so I think that, you know, certain tunnels, like maybe in Fort Lauderdale under the new river to solve some congestion problems, that may make a lot of sense. It may not be cheap, but it may be worth the investment. But tunnels everywhere is really not going to be in our future from my perspective.
Can I throw in a comment that'll bridge your question, Tony, with what the two Johns just said? In the work that we've been doing with climate change and resiliency, I've had the opportunity to go travel to different places around the country and talk to people about the issues that they're facing. And with Boston and the Big Dig, and in San Francisco with some of the issues there, there's a little key element. If they build tunnels or not, whatever, that's out of my hands. But they learned not to put sensitive infrastructure underneath the flood levels. So for example, the Big Dig tunnel in Boston, the first big flood they had, their air cooling systems and computer controls and all these different things were below the water level and got damaged. So part of the lesson is to learn to put things up above at a higher level. And I mention this because Broward County, with the surtax and looking at rail transit and different options, one of the things that may result, again, no commitment, you know, but a possible result may be some type of elevated monorail or rail system around the corridors of Broward. And so I put out a call to think about any of the sensitive infrastructure there, to place it above potential flood levels, so that if we do have problems with our roadways and they do get washed out, that the system can still continue to operate and run and provide ways for people to move around, because that will be important. In terms of the private sector and what they can do to get involved with this, that was one of the issues about building back better. You hope to learn from projects that have problems and try to do them better. One of the current things that or problems that local governments face is that if they get a storm damage that washes out a roadway, they need to build it back to the way it was previously, and can't necessarily take into account the changes that that are necessary, as Beth was talking about. Just do certain things to make the project better for the future. And so from the private sector perspective, if we could encourage our viewers that have connections to elected officials, that have connections to people at the state and federal level, to allow for the standards to change for us to build things back better. And also in South Florida, and I would say in Hillsborough, also Tampa Bay area, that the issues that we face are not the same as throughout the whole state. So Tallahassee is different from Fort Lauderdale. And so to have standards that apply evenly across the state causes challenges to us. And if we could have our viewers in the public and the private sector talk to their contacts and see if we can do some things to change some of those rules. As MPO members, government side, we're not supposed to advocate. So again, if that's something you want to do, please do so.
James is right that, talking to elected officials about why this is important is a great step. And I would just add and expand on that, all of you, everybody who is here has an audience. You have, if you're a business owner, you have employees, you may have customers. All of us have friends. Most of us have friends, I assume. Changing the mindset is going to be so important. Just being able to have a conversation about scientific facts is under challenge, has been under challenge in this country for the last few years. And we all have the opportunity to set the stage and talk about what the priorities are and demonstrate those in our decisions every day, and demonstrate those choices to everybody who's around us. So like in our organization, we're, not just promoting telework programs. We are also providing telework programs to our employees. We're providing alternate commuting methods to our employees. So we're walking the walk as well as talking the talk. There are ways to look at sustainability in almost everything that we do, and being conscious of that and opening the door to that with all of the people that we work with, and enabling them to help advance that agenda as well, is the way that we as a society are going to be able to make a difference with this.
So we only have 5 minutes left. There are a couple questions, or there's one question. I'm going to try to weave it in, having to do with how we can improve resiliency. John Englander talks about these timelines, but the fact that sea level rise is unpredictable, I suppose. But at some point, the conversation has to switch away from that, because infrastructure is always based on a given context and a reliance on its stability. So if we have an unstable context, we need to have something to ground our decisions on, because we're going to spend a lot of money. You're not going to want to spend the money on a moving target. So the question is, how do we establish that baseline as we plan ahead? If it's not,
well, even with the uncertainty,
climate compact predictions, because those predictions are published and they give a clear timeline for infrastructure projects that are 50 years, 10 years, 100 years, based on sort of a combination of projections that were developed by various scientific studies, whether it's NOAA or the Army Corps of Engineers, et cetera. So at least it's a baseline that people can plan to. If we don't use that baseline, what do you suggest?
Well, one thing is start with 30 years. I think it was when Beth was just talking about timeframes, I found that helping people visualize 30 years from now is the ideal time frame. It gets us beyond the day-to-day challenge of what we're going to do next year within our budgets or fixing a roadway or potholes. But 30 years is a home mortgage. It gets us to mid-century. It's not so distant as the year 2100, 80 years from now, 79 years from now. And so if we start framing things, what do we want this community to look like 30 years from now, is the right intermediate perspective that enables good planning, helping people see beyond what's in front of them today, but not end of century. That's my suggestion.
And if I could add to that, in some cases, like the Hollywood project that I mentioned, we're already kind of behind. It's, you know, that's a problem that we need to have solved a long time ago. With the baseline that we're looking at, though, we're facing the challenge also as the improvements go in. Do you look out to a 30-year horizon? Do you look at, hey, what's the 100-year solution? Again, with the limited funds that we have, we could do the 100-year solution on one corridor and not do anything on any of the others. Or do we do a 30-year solution and spread that money around so that it's having a greater impact on a larger area? So, you know, the good being the enemy of the perfect. I mean, moving forward and doing something now and taking those steps will, you know, will allow us, maybe in 30 years, there'll be some terribly new approaches of what we can do, but taking baby steps is better than not taking any steps at all.
So I'd like to see a greater level of collaboration between the public sector and the private sector, because, you know, when we as you know, kind of transportation planners and public sector folks talk about 30 years, I agree that is a good time, a long-term future time scale to look to. But I think that many folks in the business sector think 30 years is like, you know, might as well be a million years from now, right? Because I'm concerned about my business being around here for the next, you know, 3 to 5 years, you know, and I have a hard time planning for 5 to 10 years, and 30 years is so far into the future. As a business person, how can I even think about that? And so I think we need to develop our solutions in the public sector, you know, with those long-term 30-year goals, right? But then we need to collaborate with the private sector and bring them into the present or into the near future and get the feedback from the private sector and say, how does this relate, you know, to your perspective? You know, for them, you know, short term is 6 months or 12 months, long term might be, you know, 5 to 10 years. So we need to really work better to collaborate between the public and private sectors.
Good point, John. Tony, you're muted.
So let's take up our final poll question, since Dr. Rennie did bring up a topic that's relevant to the question. Could we post the next poll question and then we'll conclude? Do we have the poll question ready? And while that's up, any concluding remarks from our panelists? Thank you, Mr. Cromar, Ms. Alden, Dr. Rennie, and Mr. Enklander for joining us today. Any thoughts, any takeaways?
Gonna take all of us working together to make this change. We have a lot of changes, I think, come at us faster than we've been used to. And we're gonna have to be creative and hopefully give each other some grace as we all learn how to deal with the changes that will happen.
But don't underestimate the transportation may be the paradigm or pathway for which to discuss this issue with the private sector, the government, you know, to give us a very pragmatic perspective, even more than emergency management or architecture and so on, that public transportation or the transportation system, I think, is the right paradigm to think about the next 30 years, shorter and longer.
I'll just say that I'm just really impressed how many people joined this webinar, and that just shows the level of interest in this topic. So I hope that we can continue to have more dialogue like this. And, you know, hopefully in the near future, it'd be great to do this in person, because I want to hear from the audience. You know, I feel like I'm in a one-way looking glass, but I want to be able to have that two-way dialogue with those of you who probably have such great information to share with us.
And as Beth talked about having grace, I also think that it's good that we have partners who we work with. We focus on transportation, but there's so many other issues about housing, about equity, about food, about, you know, standards of living, things of that sort. So we will do our part, and we ask that our partners, both in the public and private side, do their part also to help us address these issues.
Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, based on our poll results, it looks like we will continue the conversation, and it will be a public and private effort. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.